In this lesson, we're going to look at how to add JavaScript to a theme. Now, by default, WordPress does not have a template hierarchy solution for including JavaScript files. It does have one for CSS in that it looks for a style.css file, but it's not looking for any main theme.js file. So in order to include JavaScript, we have to turn to our functions.php file, just like we did for including additional CSS. So this is some basic code for what WordPress calls enqueuing JavaScript files. Now, most of this should look pretty similar to when we enqueued theme styles. And in fact, the WP-enqueue scripts hook that we're hooking into here in pink is the exact same one that we used for our styles. So this means that we could actually write one function that includes all our scripts and all our styles at once. And this is a common approach, but it's also common to see scripts and styles being loaded into separate functions and then hooked in independently of each other into the enqueue scripts hook. So small note there, that'll make more sense as we get into hooks and all of that. But what we really want to look at now that we see this kind of wrapper element to get our scripts hooked in is this WP-enqueue script function. So the WP-enqueue script function is also very similar to the WP-enqueue style function in that it takes a handle, a source, any dependencies, the version number, and then in this case, instead of determining whether it should be applied to all media devices, it's giving us a Boolean option, a true-false option of whether we want our JavaScript to go in the footer or the header. So remember the WP header and WP foot tags that we put into our theme earlier to get plug-in JavaScript to load and the customizer and stuff like that, or the admin bar across the top of the screen. So we have two options in WordPress. Our code can go into the header right before it closes, or it can go into the footer. In most cases, you see JavaScript preferred to be loaded in the footer unless there's another reason. So in order to load in footer, you would just say true, but by default, I believe it's false, so it will go in the header. So let's jump from here into our code and look at adding a JavaScript file, just doing some simple JavaScript, and then we'll talk about a few other related things in relation to dependencies in JavaScript. Okay, so in my editor here, the first thing I'm going to do is come into my assets folder, and just like I have a CSS folder, I'm going to add a JS folder. And then inside of here, I'm going to create a new file and name it theme.js. So what do we want our theme.js to do? For now, let's just say console log loaded. And this will allow us to just check that everything is loaded. Then we can come back and do some quick JavaScript here. Okay, so to load this up, we have to come into our functions.php file. And this whole function here, load in our CSS, enqueue styles, is hooking into the WP-enqueue scripts. So like I said, we could put our WP-enqueue script here inside this function, but I'm actually going to copy this all and change it over. So we need to change the function name so that we have a unique name, and then we need to paste it down here so that it's being hooked in properly. And then we can delete everything inside of that function and start fresh. So I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here. And we'll start off by WP-enqueue script. Okay, so the first thing we have to put in is a handle for ours, and we're just going to call this theme.js in case we want to include it as a dependency or do other things with it. That's how we would reference it in other places. Then we've got to put in a link to our file, and we could do that pretty easily by just coming up here and copying the same code. Get style sheet directory URI is going to get us into our theme, and then we could say assets.js theme.js. Okay, so with that done, the next thing we have to do is add in our dependencies. And in this case, we're going to pass an empty array because we're not going to include any dependencies with this. I'll come back after we look at this and show you how to work with some of the dependencies. But for now, we'll leave that blank. Then the next one is version number. And this is a place where I would suggest during development, you just put in a timestamp so that it will not get cached. It'll automatically load this each time. But once you're done, you could either assign your own version number or just leave that blank or set it to null, and it will give you an automatic version number. Okay, so ours is going to be equal to time. And then finally, whether we want this in our header or footer, we're going to put it in our footer, which is my general recommendation for your JavaScript. So now let's just come over to our site and make sure that this is loaded. Again, in our theme.js, we're just saying loaded in the console, so we should be able to see that. Let's come over to our site now. Okay, so if I come over to my site and I open up the inspector, which you could do by right-clicking and clicking in inspect, or just Command-Option-I on the Mac, we will see that we have elements, which is what we normally look at to find something in a page, hopefully know about how to use that and navigate it. But we also have a console tab. So I want to open up the console, and this is from our JavaScript saying loaded. So we know that it's working. Now let's do something a little bit more practical with our JavaScript. When we click on this project button, it's going to open in the same tab, and we can easily make it open in a new tab. So what I want to do is come into my element selector, and I want to grab this because I want to select it with my JavaScript, and we could say that it's an anchor tag with a button class, and we know that we're on a single portfolio page. So what I want to do is grab any a.button on a single portfolio, which I know on my site is just going to be this. You'll have to select something special based on whatever your site is, but this isn't a lesson in JavaScript. It's really just a lesson in how to include JavaScript on the page. So let's go do something simple here. If we come back to our theme.js, we're going to set up a variable called project button. And this is a variable just like in PHP, except instead of using a $, we're using var. And then we have to set that to be equal to document.querySelector. And if you haven't used query selector before, it basically just lets you pass CSS classes just like you would write in CSS, but it's going to give you back an HTML element from the page, or DOM element from the page. So we had single portfolio a.button. Let me just show you that on one line. Okay. Query selector. All right, so we go into the document page, or the DOM, we get whatever button is inside of a single portfolio class, and we save that as project button. Then we could easily say project button target equal to blank. And what this is doing is adding an HTML attribute of target equal to underscore blank. You may have added this to your HTML before, and it's going to open it up in a new tab. Again, just something quick and easy, and let's just go test that it's working. Okay, so when I come to my page now and click on my button, notice that it is popping it open in a new tab, and if I were to inspect it, we could see that it now has a target equal to blank, which was not there before. So that is the basic way that you would include JavaScript on a page. If we come back into our functions, if we wanted to add other JavaScript files, we would just copy and paste this over. And I'll mention one last thing about this. And this, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, this may be out of your frame of reference. But one thing that this is doing is polluting what's called the global namespace. And basically, this project button is going to be available in all JavaScript files because it's not kind of scoped to this one file here. So one thing you may want to do if you don't want to do that, because the problem there is if anybody else references project button in their project, they pick a name, or let's just say you named it something common like this, there's a chance that they may conflict with other JavaScript and maybe cause unforeseen errors. So what we want to do is actually create what's called an immediately evoked function in JavaScript and put our code inside of it. And what that allows you to do is kind of scope and make your code your own, so it won't interfere with any other files. Now, you may not want this approach and you may take it out, but I wanted to just show you that in general, it's not a bad practice to do that. The other reason I'm mentioning it is because when we work with certain dependencies, you may see this pattern of an immediately or ify function set up. So that's just to give you as headway into the next step, because in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to work with some of the dependencies, particularly jQuery, and you'll need to see this pattern and work with it. But here's what you need to do before we get into that. What I want you to do is follow along, code all this out on your own. Practice writing the word in Q, because that gets messed up in Q scripts here versus in Q scripts singular there. There's just a lot of little teeny things. So get comfortable typing it all out. Get a basic theme.js up and running. You could use the same kind of code that we're using, or if you know JavaScript, you could write some of your own, or you could just leave it as a console log loaded just to test that it works. So get that far, and then in the next lesson, I'm going to get in some of the dependencies like jQuery. So hold off on building out your project too much at this point. You'll do that after the next lesson, but at least catch up with where we are at this point in queuing our JavaScript.